They gave Canada 72 hours to surrender. Canada answered in under 3, not with a counteroffer, not with a polite diplomatic stall, not with lawyers and back-channel whispers, with 2 sentences, on camera, in 90 seconds flat. And then the microphone went cold, no questions taken, no room left for spin, just the sound of a door closing behind the man who just told the most powerful economy on earth, no. Tonight, we are going to walk through every single detail of what actually happened, what Trump demanded, what Carney said word for word, why those 90 seconds may go down as the single most strategically precise statement made by any world leader this entire year, what the financial markets did the moment Carney walked away from that podium, and the 3 very different futures that now lie ahead for this continent. Futures that will directly affect what you pay for gas, what you spend at the grocery store, and what the economic landscape of North America looks like for the next generation. This is not commentary. This is not opinion. This is the full picture, laid out in precise detail, because what happened today is the kind of event that gets taught in university courses on diplomacy, geopolitics, and international trade for the next 2 decades. And most of the media is only giving you a headline. Stay with us through this entire report, because the next 48 hours will change things. Let's start at the very beginning. At 8:15 in the morning, the White House released a formal document through the Office of the United States Trade Representative. The title was carefully crafted, a framework for a modernized bilateral trade relationship between the United States and Canada. Every single word in that headline was chosen to project an image of cooperation, of progress, of 2 partners, or updating a relationship for the modern era. But when you stripped away the Polish and read what was actually inside that document, a completely different picture emerged. There were 4 conditions. And every single one of them was framed not as an opening position for negotiation, but as a non-negotiable precondition that Canada had to accept before any formal talks could even begin. Condition 1, Canada must immediately and unconditionally remove every single retaliatory tariff it had placed on American goods. Not phase them out, not discuss a timeline, remove them, all of them. Every dollar of the roughly $30 billion in countermeasures Canada had deployed, gone before the first handshake ever happened. The message embedded in that demand was unmistakable. Surrender your leverage first. Hand over everything we want up front. Only then will we consider sitting down with you. Condition 2 focused on energy. Canada was told to commit to locked-in, guaranteed pricing arrangements on all major energy exports flowing south. Crude oil, natural gas, electricity. Washington framed this as a matter of American energy security. Canadian officials, speaking privately, described it in far blunter terms. A foreign government attempting to impose price controls on another sovereign nation's natural resources. Let that sink in. These are resources Canada owns, resources that Canadian workers locate, extract, and process. And the demand was for Washington to effectively set the price at which those resources get sold. That is not a trade negotiation. That is an intrusion into national economic sovereignty. Condition 3 dealt with metals. Canada was required to formally acknowledge and accept the continuation of American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, permanently, not as a temporary safeguard, not as something subject to future review, as a fixed, enduring feature of the new reality. Canada would have to sign documentation agreeing that its steel and aluminum industries would operate under U.S.-imposed restrictions indefinitely. That was the ask, and Condition 4 was the one that immediately set alarm bells ringing in Ottawa's policy circles. Canada was told to align its entire agricultural regulatory system with American food safety standards and farming benchmarks, immediately and without negotiation, as another precondition before formal talks could begin. Not as a phased harmonization, not as a mutual convergence process, right now, before the conversation starts. Taken together, these were not 4 opening bids in a negotiation. They were 4 demands for structural, unilateral concessions. All of them required upfront before Canada could even take a seat at the table. And attached to the entire package was an explicit threat. Fail to comply, and a new aggressive round of tariffs targeting Canadian energy exports would be triggered without delay. What Washington apparently did not anticipate was what happened next. At exactly 11:32 that same morning, a press podium in Ottawa became the center of the geopolitical world. The room was standing room only. Cameras lined every wall. Members of the press had been told almost nothing in advance, only that the Prime Minister would be appearing personally to deliver Canada's official reply. Mark Carney stepped forward. He adjusted the microphone. He looked directly into the cameras. And he began to speak with the calm, measured, deliberate precision of someone who has spent years navigating the highest stakes rooms in global finance and politics. He stated clearly, and without any ambiguity whatsoever, that Canada would under no circumstances accept any set of preconditions that required the surrender or compromise of Canadian sovereignty before negotiations had even been permitted to start. He then declared just as firmly that Canada would never sign any agreement that treated its own natural resources, resources fundamental to Canada's national economy and identity, as though they were simply an extension of American domestic energy policy. Then he stepped back from the podium. He took 0 questions. He turned and walked out of the room. 90 seconds, 2 sentences, not a single question answered. And in that moment, every seasoned analyst, every experienced diplomat, every trade lawyer watching the live feed understood exactly what had just happened. Carney had not simply rejected the proposal on the table. He had done something far more calculated and far more durable. He had used a global platform to publicly articulate, before the eyes of the entire watching world, the precise red lines under which Canada would categorically refuse to proceed. He had made those lines impossible to misread, and he had positioned them in such a way that any future Canadian leader who considered walking back from them would face immediate and severe domestic political consequences at home. This was not improvised. This was architecture, strategic positioning built with long-term implications, deliberately in mind. In refusing Trump today, Carney had not just said no. He had built a structure that made it extraordinarily costly for Canada to ever say yes to these terms under any future wave of pressure. Washington's reaction came within the hour. Trump took to social media calling Carney's refusal a very big mistake and warning that Canada would soon feel the full weight of the consequences. The White House press secretary followed with a prepared statement describing Canada as an ungrateful trading partner, actively choosing to damage a relationship that had served Canadian interests well for decades. The public posture was loud, confident, full of self-assurance. But beneath that confident surface, something else was already happening. Republican senators and governors, particularly those representing states heavily involved in agriculture and energy production, were flooding Capitol Hill offices and White House phone lines with urgent calls. They were asking one deeply uncomfortable question, and they were not getting comfortable answers. At the same time, the financial markets had already rendered their own verdict. They did not wait for politicians to sort this out. The moment Carney concluded his remarks and left the stage, the markets moved. The Canadian dollar strengthened noticeably against the U.S. dollar. Currency traders read Carney's refusal as a credible signal. Ottawa was prepared to weather a prolonged standoff without flinching. Shares in major American energy companies dropped sharply, between 3 and 6% during the afternoon session. Agricultural commodity prices for corn and soybeans slid lower as investors began factoring in the growing probability that this dispute would drag on far longer than initial forecasts had suggested. The broader American equity market closed down a full 1.8%. Early stress signals appeared in bond markets. Gold prices climbed as institutional investors shifted capital into safe haven assets. Across every asset class, the message from the trading floors was the same, consistent, and impossible to dismiss. The investment community does not expect a quick or easy resolution. Participants are actively positioning for a prolonged period of uncertainty, and they are moving money accordingly. Here is the thing that is critical to understand, and that most coverage is glossing over entirely. At the heart of Trump's entire strategic approach toward Canada lies a single foundational assumption. The American economy is roughly 10 times larger than Canada's. Therefore, Washington holds decisive leverage. Ottawa will eventually fold. For many countries around the world, that assumption carries real weight. But Canada is not most countries. The American economy is not merely trading with Canada. It is structurally dependent on Canada in ways that are deeply embedded and nearly impossible to replace on any realistic timeline. Consider this: 43 out of 50 American states count Canada as either their single largest or second largest export destination. American auto manufacturing plants operate through just-in-time supply chains that cross the border dozens of times in the production of a single finished vehicle. American farmers depend on access to Canadian markets to sustain billions in annual export revenue. and Canada supplies approximately 4 million barrels of crude oil per day directly into American refineries. Every new tariff on that supply does not just hurt Canada, it raises operating costs for U.S. refineries, drives up input costs for American manufacturers, and ultimately puts higher prices at the gas pump and on home heating bills for American families, in states that matter enormously in national elections. This is not a one-directional dependency. This is a deeply mutual, intricately woven economic system, where disruption creates simultaneous damage on both sides of the border. Canada understood that dynamic. The critical question tonight is whether Washington fully grasped it before it issued the ultimatum. So where does this go from here? 3 paths lie ahead. Only one of them ends well for ordinary working families on both sides of the border. In the first scenario, mounting pressure from Republican senators and governors representing energy-producing and farm-dependent states eventually compels the White House to quietly recalibrate. A revised, softened framework emerges, one that drops the most aggressive demands, particularly the energy pricing controls and the agricultural regulatory alignment requirements. Canada agrees to enter formal, good-faith negotiations without being forced to accept preconditions up front. Both sides announce a pause in further tariff escalation. A narrower deal eventually emerges. The administration declares a political victory to its domestic base. Canada credibly claims it defended its sovereignty. Both narratives contain truth. The relationship stabilizes, but the trust has been visibly eroded. Future interactions become more transactional, more cautious, and markedly less instinctive. In the second scenario, neither side moves. The deadline expires. The threatened energy tariffs are implemented. Canada responds with a new round of carefully targeted countermeasures directed at sectors not yet included in its existing retaliatory package. Real disruptions appear in the North American automotive supply chain. American consumers see higher fuel prices and elevated utility bills. The domestic political environment inside the United States becomes considerably more hostile for the administration, as those costs become personal and tangible to voters in states that carry real electoral weight. Negotiations do eventually resume, but only after both countries have absorbed significant mutual economic damage and face far higher political stakes than existed at the outset. And then there is the third scenario, the one few voices in Washington are willing to say out loud right now. Carney's refusal today does not merely define the immediate Canada-US dynamic. It functions as a turning point in how the broader international community evaluates the credibility and limits of American trade pressure when applied to close allies. Other American partners around the world watch this with close attention and draw their own conclusions about the long-term reliability of the United States as a partner. Many of them quietly accelerate existing efforts to diversify their trade relationships. Canada deepens its commercial ties with partners in Europe and across Asia. Some of those newly expanded relationships prove durable and lasting, regardless of how the current dispute ends. And over time, the foundational assumption that privileged access to the American market automatically overrides every other strategic consideration begins, slowly, measurably, and irreversibly, to erode. What today has laid bare is a direct collision between two fundamentally different theories of how power actually works in the modern global economy. Trump's theory is straightforward. Size determines outcomes. The bigger economy wins. The smaller one folds. Carney's theory is more nuanced. Leverage is never determined by size alone. It emerges from mutual dependency, from the specific contours of political geography, from the domestic political costs that aggressive pressure generates within the country applying the pressure, and from the level of preparation, credibility, and strategic clarity the receiving party brings to the confrontation. A smaller economy, deploying a sophisticated and precisely targeted strategy, can generate disproportionate political pressure on a much larger counterpart, provided it knows exactly where and how to apply force for maximum effect. Carney has spent his entire professional life studying and operating within precisely these dynamics. He understands which industries carry the greatest political weight in which electoral districts on both sides of the border. He knows that in the right conditions, 90 seconds can reverberate further and last longer than 100 press conferences. When he walked to that podium this morning, he was not winging it. He knew what he was going to say. He knew the strategic weight those words would carry, and he knew the concrete cost that escalation would impose on both nations if Washington chose to double down rather than recalibrate. Somewhere in Ottawa tonight, Carney and his advisors are watching developments with measured, deliberate confidence. Somewhere in Washington, senior officials are fielding a steady stream of calls from concerned senators and governors, all of them circling back to variations of the same increasingly urgent question. What does the strategic landscape actually look like if Canada simply refuses to blink? The answer that emerges to that question will do more than determine the next chapter of North American trade. It will reveal, in practical and enduring terms, the real outer limits of American economic coercion when applied against close allies who understand the dynamics most thoroughly and who are prepared to act accordingly. Donald Trump handed Canada a 72-hour deadline. Mark Carney gave his answer in under 3. And as a direct result, the continent we share will not look, or function quite the same way again. If this reporting gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening, subscribe now for continuing in-depth coverage of the Canada-US relationship that is actively reshaping this entire decade. And share this video, because the decisions made in the next 48 hours will touch the life of every single family living on both sides of this border.